So just a bit of context. So we're here at the NYIT show. It's a collateral event of the Venice Architecture Biennale, and they were so gracious to let us, a virtual version of the Venice Biennale, to be kind of associated with this collateral event. And you see here the video of the Metaverse Metrotopia, where we're live streaming into an audience there, and record also what happens there. Yesterday we had a press conference here, we launched a press event inside Metrotopia, as well as a vernissage and a panel discussion about similar issues, about 5 critical articles about the crit, and somehow the way schools of architecture also in decline in terms of discourse atrophy and on a very bit trajectory. So so Metrotopia is a metaverse which we're just launching, which is addressing and hoping to become a kind of creative industry hub, virtual city for everything to do with architecture, all the design disciplines, all the design media, schools, museums, biennales, exhibitions, so the whole ecosystem, trying to be really kind of, co-location synergies and getting to work, nothing to do with video games, using, of course, video game technology to really generate a new platform. And so OMA is one of the projects that we're showing, as well as a number of other major architects. So in that framework, that's why we're sitting here. We're kind of remotely located.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is the academic quarter nearly approaching its end?
Yes, 1 more minute. It's a shame, I would have loved to have Wolf Briggs find his way here. Okay, so, well, first of all, I love the book. Reinier, congratulations.
Thank you.
Kick-ass, important, quite serious. You find a way always making the serious things feel light and flippant and funny, and I think that's not a bad way. I had, in 2017, you came out with 4 Walls on the Roof. Very interesting book also, and Peter Murray had us similarly situated on stage to discuss that book. I published a review of it, and I've kind of written already 4,000 words about this one, but I have to kind of precautionary kind of editing a few more rounds before this is released. And I think the way you've been talking about this, you kind of a mythbuster, and 4 Walls and the Roof was myth which kind of is circulating within the discipline and need to be kind of questioned and queried, and this one is supposedly addressing myth which circulate in society about architecture and imposing upon architecture, and architecture is kind of snowed under with stuff. We need to kind of dig ourselves out of that. And so I wanted to kick it off with just a few quotes, and each of them has a very small kind of challenge already in it, but just to give you a sense what the book is about, what I would say is a very strong introduction, and then there's a strong appendix called Prof Speak, kind of the architectural version of Newspeak or Valley Newspeak. I love that. It's a very apt kind of metaphor and analogy, and so these are manifesto style, I would say. Right on. And then we tease the bookends. We have a series of chapters, 10 chapters more or less, which are more informative and conversational about going to the depths of some of the origins of some of these, let's say, Prof Speaks themes, as there are, sustainability, livability, well-being, and all coming along with these measures and metrics and rankings and ratings and so on, and an endless litany of recitation, never saying something new, everybody's talking the talk, and that, in my view, the main thing here is there's no space left to talk about project specifics, what the discipline has to bring to all these issues, and it's just recitation, and we need to kind of, as far as I'm concerned, we need to breathe again and have a proper discourse. We need to kind of suspend all this talk. It doesn't mean that innovation in each of these arenas isn't worthy of talking about. Endless recitation of taken for granted things. So the quote, I would say, to kick it off, the overriding quest of the book. So these are some citations from the introduction, moving backwards. The quest of architecture to be architecture again, ridding it of its unsolicited baggage. Architect verb aims to debunk myth projected onto architecture by the outside world, rebuttal of doctrines which have been applied to architecture over the last 20 years. And I agree with that, but I think what my point was, so you're talking a lot about impositions, but I feel they're being kind of eagerly gobbled up, all too eagerly, are becoming self-imposed, because there's incredible convenience coming with these, because if you can recite these headlines and you can kind of avoid it's totally risk-free because they don't bear any objections or arguments. You just get nods, solicit nods instead of arguments. And it gives you, you're lifting yourself on a moral high ground, and maybe, or just at least on a moral safe ground, and you can avoid talking about project specifics, about your particular ideas and agendas, because all the time, any project pitches or presentation is kind of consumed by this stuff, which is just, at this point, I would say, first of all, obligatory themes. You have to comply with reciting them, and there's nothing much new, so it just clogs up the totality of the space. So that's why this kind of thing, I feel, is very much self-imposed, and we have to internally crack that open, and we probably could. And I love that, as I said, the subtitle of the book is The New Language of Building, and I would translate it as the new speak of architecture.
But that subtitle is actually an imposition. There's a little anecdote about that.
Okay.
So the publisher is half British, half American, and the Americans don't do irony, I was told. The original subtitle of this book is The Ultimate Guide to World-Class, Award-Winning, Innovative, Creative, Sustainable, Livable, Beautiful Buildings that Foster a Sense of Place and Well-Being. One where you run out of breath if you're trying to pronounce it. And I thought that was a wonderful subtitle, because that's the 10 terms that the book deals with. When you clock them into a single sentence, the absurdity is so manifest that in a way you no longer have to write the book. So I thought that was a kind of, prof speak poetry. But they didn't want that for some reason, and I think that is partly indicative of how much people embrace things they don't understand, and that even publishing is a kind of very weird thing. I was listening to you, and I very much agree. I think the architectural world has eaten up these impositions, but I would say even when you eat up an imposition, it doesn't necessarily undo the fact that it's still an imposition. I think it's still an imposition, but it's been eaten up to an extent that we, as a profession, forgot that this is an imposition. So maybe in the most humble way, the book is a reminder of that. It's a reminder of the fact that all of these things we meanwhile have incorporated in our discourse happily, and you hear every next architect also using these terms without any irony, that they are actually a product of us being told what to do. And in that sense, that's what the book does. I mean, the 10 essays in between simply trace the origin of these terms, analyze at what moment they enter the discourse, and also uncovers that the moment they entered the discourse, they actually meant something different than they have come to mean over time. So I think that's, but that's just a side note to what you said.
Yes, and I feel you agree with these impositions, and they operate in society at large with a similar, let's say, strange intolerance, and we have an overall problem with the discourse culture intellectually in academia, but also in corporate contexts and political contexts, and that becomes very, very obvious, increasingly obvious and oppressive. So the way I see the kind of connection with the newspeak, prof speak, it's really saying something quite strong. We're in a situation where the discourse has become both vacuously euphemistic and oppressive, in the sense that there's an accusatory thrust you're talking about. And I like this quote. Well, actually, I want to quote another phrase. And of course, it has a pseudoscientific kind of measurement system. So unsubstantiated commonplaces are imposed upon us, and they come with the arbitrary measurement systems that sustain them. And I do agree. I mean, these are, I think, all of these, let's say, particularly well-being, for instance, and the idea of environmental psychology, just to pick out one of them, is ahistorical. I think it's totally inadequate with respect to the diversity of cultural situation, social situation, audience, and so on. There's a kind of human universal of well-being. I think that's pseudoscience, and anyway, it's super shallow stuff. And again, it's clogging up our discipline. And I want to say, I mean, come to, let's say, the following phrase, and it comes with a challenge. Once a discipline of ideas, you're talking about architecture, architecture is progressively expected to comply to standards imposed by others. The besieged profession forced to adopt ever more extreme postures of virtue. So what kind of ideas are we talking about? And I wanted to be a bit of the devil's advocate. I think there is a lot of worthy things to be debated which have nothing to do with these headline phrases. So I've managed to lecture several hundred lectures at 250 articles and thousands of book pages without ever referencing any of these agendas or phrases. There's lots to talk about, we can get into this, but the suspicion is, and that's why I wanted to kind of fortify the argument, how is this, let's say, refusal not a rearguard action of architects trying to, let's say, evade their responsibility for the sake of a self-indulgent pursuit of their art, their idiosyncratic kind of hobby horse ideas, modeled on the autonomous artist. So if you think about before this happened, what was counting as an idea and what would architects get away with is also problematic. And I think you will.
True.
If you think of a Libeskind 1995, saying what this project is about. I mean, on a large-scale project, this becomes kind of possibly indefensible. But anyway, so I wanted to see how you. I mean, I can help, but what you would say.
But my book is not a plea for a license to kill. Again, not at all. But and it almost, even if it were, it would be all right, because I mean that license is pretty unobtainable as things stand. The last book, or the first book I wrote, which we also spoke about, was, I took the piss out of the hubris of architects. Essentially, that's the short summary of that book. I debunked myths cultivated by architects, the inflated idea of themselves, of which every biennale, in some way is a form of the ultimate expression. And I took great delight into eating away at that. But now it's 6 years later, and I somehow think that the profession I once... Of course, I love the profession. I wouldn't do the profession if I loved the profession. So any attack by me is not really an attack. It's an expression of a certain uncomfortable state. But meanwhile, I no longer feel that. I feel that that architecture, meanwhile, has become something in need of defense, in need of proper defense. And I think, architecture can only exist by virtue of an immense tolerance of people, of architects. I mean, architecture is such a vague, mingle between subjectivity, objectivity, post-rationalizing things, etc., etc., etc. And from that, occasionally something very beautiful emerges. Something people didn't know they wanted. I think that's the task of architects. You can tell an architect what you want, and then you may get what you want, but the ultimate task of an architect is to give you also something you didn't know you wanted, but you only discover that you wanted it when you see it. So it requires a huge leap of faith. And, you know, the subtitle that I just quoted, it's a foregone conclusion. So it is a direct barrier in the way of creativity, which by definition always requires a leap of faith. So I preach for a certain tolerance for a breed of people that would become pretty insufferable when the tolerance would stretch so far, but I think the tolerance has been minimized to such an extent that I feel that is the camp I ought to defend for the time being. And you talk about prof speak in relation to newspeak. I think there is a very interesting phenomenon going on. You know, Orwell in Newspeak, he killed sort of half the terms in the dictionary. From the philosophy is that if I deny you the words, you can no longer think the things the words signify. The current form of prospeak operates almost on the inverse principle, by flooding us with so many words, flooding us with so many euphemisms, such verbosity that they sort of intoxicate you into a state of inebriation, and then you also can't think. I mean, you blabber, but think that the notion people first design is a very interesting one. People first design, the definition of people first design is that it puts people first. Which evidently means that if you need the adjective, if you need the addition, it implies that design evidently didn't put people first. And therefore anybody previously associated with design probably didn't consider people at all and is a criminal by default. So in the good speak that you have, there is an infinitely malignant tendency of a permanent education without permanent accusation, without ever manifesting itself as an accusation, and therefore also denying the possibility of defense and also denying the possibility of discourse. And the progressive impossibility of discourse, you know, with all the erratic aberrations it might bring in its wake, that is a real problem. You know, fill out any request for proposal when you have to qualify for a job. You have to use these terms. How's your firm on livability? Patrick, how's your firm on putting people first? You get these questions and you can only say, well, we've always put people first. And you spend your life talking about them. And architecture is ultimately a marvel of the operational. Architecture is not about what, it's about how, mainly. You know, and I think that's the weird thing. Architecture did all of those things. I mean, there's a huge tradition in architecture of building lightweight buildings, an economy of means, all of the things that, you know, have become very, very pertinent in the face of what's happening, obviously, but to sort of claim that architecture is a discipline without a tradition, wonderfully oblivious of the current necessities, is completely wrong and unjustified in my position. From my point of view.
The problem is that we're talking mostly about these, you're making claims, and there's no much operationalization that remains kind of elusive. How you specify characteristics in particular project particulars to make, for instance, this design people-centered. So it operates largely rhetorical, and then and the kind of once you have confirmed these attentions, you kind of already running out of space. That's a big problem. But I think in terms of what you're saying, let's say the serendipitous discovery out of an intuitive process of some things which might fall into place and might be picked up and appropriated and have a life. All of this is correct, but I think we need to, in terms of to fortify that space. First of all, this part of the space, which is, let's say, for instance, also includes formal research of works of people like Peter Eisenman and Jeff Kipnis and Greg Lynn, technical design methodology research, exploring algorithms and so on. There's a lot of this kind of propedeutic, this prolegomena, which you can at that point defend. But we know that this will be evolving into repertoires and methodologies which can cope with the larger kind of challenges and complexities of society out there. But you need this kind of incubation space, an internal discursive condition, which is in schools and in biennales. That's why I call it necessarily internal, because they don't sustain at this point any pistol on your chest. How this is helping society at this point. And you have to kind of say, wait, and so I think I use the distinction between, avant-garde and mainstream, and there's even some of the build works have that character. Let's say they are manifesto projects. They're not about the here and now fulfilling certain functional needs. For instance, it's clear in things like the Barcelona Pavilion because it was just a display. But this extends also to things like Vitra Fire Station or the house Schröder from Riedfeld. They're not about the Schröder family. They're kind of, manifestos projecting, theoretical projects with drawings, models, discourses, projecting something new to be redeemed and fulfilled in a later, more consequential applications. And we need that space of incubation. I mean, to fill we need to talk a lot, but that cannot be brought in front of external audiences because they can't deal with it. And then we get mystified into the artistic, into the genius, let's say the protective thing is then when you say, okay, this is art, these are artists we need to respect. I don't think ultimately that stands up, because I think the whole point of this is that eventually this avant-garde has to kind of answer all the questions, and these repertoires you're investing in will be brought to bear, and I think it's a cumulative disciplinary process which comes in waves also historically, where you have to readapt the field and discipline, these repertoires and let's say values and concepts and theories with the changing societal, let's say, transformations. So I think the big waves, the big epochal waves, like for instance from the 19th century, laissez-faire capitalism, already against the previous votes. When you come into the early 20th century, we have the socialist revolutions, we have mass mechanical reproduction, big factory scale, a new kind of, let's say, Fordist reproduction paradigm, and that's where, and it's very funny the way the abstract art feeds into and brings repertoires and possibilities to make that happen. And so in a way, it's strangely abstract art and avant-gardist architecture, the Bauhaus experience, Wuthemas, in the end they make possible what happens, the rollout of the 50s, 60s to 70s. And similarly, I would say, but then there's a crisis of this paradigm can no longer continue, and you have this kind of functional city and monotony. And so we had this other wave of transformative revolution, internal aesthetic revolutions, internal methodology revolutions, a totally changeover of the guard of protagonists, let's say, and they're initially more intuitive, mavericks, inverted commas, like Wolf and Zaha and Rank and so on and so forth. But eventually all of this, then we mature and we make great contributions. We need to kind of live up to the promise. And then I think of this historically, so yes, we need that space, and maybe that space is not equally necessary and on the same level of, we need to start kind of taking each other to task, that we can't randomly mutate and hoping that we inspire some appropriation. So we need to have a kind of more kind of disciplined, we take responsibility of our part of the built environment responsibility to gear it up to the contemporary, let's say, post-photo network society and the new kind of urban renaissance we're seeing and the high density complex, city districts. And by the way, so that's the way I look at it. And we need to sort this through, and I think in the end we're not just relying on this kind of tolerance letters. And you can't ask for decades of tolerance and never coming to fruition. That's the way I see it. But it's very important that we have this discourse internally protected, but we have to work, we take each other to task in sharp criticism and engagement, so that we're actually gearing up and take responsibility for the totality of the built environment and world of artifacts in terms of its, what I call, organizational, phenomenological, semiological, let's say the way it interfaces of interactions, communication, framing, which we are in charge of, social functionality, not technical functionality, which we need to kind of be constrained by, we need to respond to and build in. And for instance, just one more word, sustainability, the whole discourse, is obviously just a constraint, which we take on within, like other economic constraints, within which we now kind of develop purposes for making the best of the most productive and life-enhancing social spaces. It can't be the end-all, it can't be the primary goal, it is always only constrained. The purposes have to be formulated positively in terms of the kind of life process we want to have, and that are constrained with what do we want, and we do it with the least, let's say, ecological footprint. What we're having now is a kind of tail wagging the dog. Which if you take that seriously, means don't build at all, because that's the most sustainable in these terms. So that's obviously. But I think I wanted to suggest that yes, there's all these And I've always defended, let's say, even radical formalists like Eisman, who was saying, I have nothing to do with any of this. Architecture is pure formal research. We need that, because without that you have not the repertoire, you have a division of labor within the field to bring it to bear. And even the Bauers, the crazy artists, in the end were feeding into what they delivered at the end of the decade, for instance.
What's your question to me?
So my question was, challenge was, that, let's say, this tolerance which we need isn't in itself enough. We have to...
No, yes.
But it's important that it's only internal and not... You can't expect the world to be tolerant of this.
But there is no creativity without intimacy. I think there is a limit, or there is a necessary minimum of time you need to yourself. There is a necessary minimum of time you need with people you trust and you feel sort of okay saying things that will not entirely you won't be arraigned for, etc., etc. But of course, not decades. I mean, no project ever allows you decades. But I think there's that. And I read an interesting article by a scientist who even questioned the nature of brainstorming in itself as an effective method of creation. It says there is the ultimate intimacy is when you are on your own for a while, completely without anybody else, and then ideas come, etc. So she was even advocating a space that was even more private to the self. And I think there is that. And in the age of, I hate Zoom, and I hate Teams, and I hate that because it allows unlimited amount of meetings. Go to a Chinese restaurant, and you've gone there for 10 years, and you've always eaten there with great delight. You had good meals, were very happy, and then you decide to visit the kitchen, and you never return. And this is a little bit for me. The current method of communication, COVID and the pandemic has allowed us infinite amount of meetings, even to the extent that you cannot prepare for meetings anymore. And part of the prof speak is I think, massively escalated during Corona. Because imagine, you're a consultant, you have a meeting, but you just had a meeting before, you had no time to prepare, and you have to propose what to do. What do you say? You say, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We've got to look at the broader picture first. We've got to look at the overarching vision. I mean, English is a great language in terms of providing infinite excuses not to work. I mean, it's par excellence. I think the culture we're talking is work, or more equated to work than almost anywhere else. But that is what is happening. I think there is a whole... In the absence of creative intimacy, language proliferates as a simulation of a discussion that isn't really a discussion, but just a perpetual excuse and a perpetual form of defense, of not being a good person, not having done any work, etc. And there is this kind of almost Catholic state of mind invading the profession, I think, exacerbated. I mean, that's dangerous. But I might advocate for limitless tolerance, because if you do, you might get some tolerance. And I think if something that Eisenman has done in a wonderful way is monopolize the American education system in a plea for infinite tolerance to get some tolerance. But look at the state of American practice. He hasn't been that successful. And that's it. And you can say a lot of things, not because you want things necessarily to happen one-on-one, but simply as a form of pushback. That is...
Look, what I feel is that, for instance, if we're talking about the formalists, and I do think that you can't go head-on problem-solving, then you're always kind of stuck on with the problem-solving repertoire. It's a formal repertoire, so problem-solving repertoires. So at one point you need to take time aside, away, when you're just exploring.
But I think architecture
and that ways of form making, and that's kind of quite a few steps of argument to explain to somebody that this has meaning, because you don't know yet what its meaning is. And in a strange way, the art world is that larger societal brainstorming chamber where a lot of creative industry professionals refer to, dabble with in the early parts of the career. They're professional artists who are just kind of generating inspiration, but they're intuitively attuned with certain phenomena of the time that you can't defend. And no artwork is ever a function, a purpose, a justification, really. And we need that space. So that's the most radical form of tolerance, and we have given that space.
Yeah, but
So, and that feeds in, and as I said, abstract art was feeding into architecture. There's many levels. So that's the most extreme case and point. And then I said these avant-garde movements within architecture. And I think in terms of an historical trajectory, they will recede, and the more, let's say, becoming scientific takes over. So that's what you actually saw in modernism. You have this kind of maturing process. So at the beginning of the Bauhaus, you had kind of Itten and Schlemmer, and they were kind of, and even Malevich, these were kind of, in a sense, crazy gurus who full of superstitions, and that allowed them to generate stuff. At the end of the 20s, they were all gone, and you had a kind of proper project of rolling.
Well,
historicizing in this way, I think.
Can you allow me some?
Yeah, of course.
Airtime. It's a very interesting analogy because, a lot of the Russian constructivists like Malevich, Melnikov, they had to, under Stalin, when the regime changed, they had to sign confessions, they had to sign declarations of loyalty to the new regime, almost admitting that everything they had done before was wrong, and they needed to publicly apologize for that. And I never thought of this until you mentioned it, but I think the current moment, we're eerily close to precisely that. And, the measure of any civilized society is the tolerance it has for its mad people. Plain and simple.
Sure. Look.
Even if these mad people, you talk about mad people being useful over time,
yeah.
Maybe. Some people are just mad, and they're not useful over time. But if you don't take the chance
absolutely
on that some of the mad might be useful over time.
That's like evolutionary process.
That's it.
That's the aspect of mutation and random recombination in the evolutionary process, and then you have a huge sifting. And I would expect, for instance, in terms of artists and contemporary art, 99% is waste, but we need that 1%, which triggers off. And sometimes,
but you'll never have the 1% if you don't have the waste.
Absolutely,
that's it.
And that's why I defend it.
And I think, therefore, efficiency. We see all of these things. Ever more meetings, ever more things, ever more. The more you optimize the creative process in the name of efficiency, the less efficient you will be. It almost becomes like making love on camera, which I think very few of us, would be able to do. But it's a very bad comparison, obviously. But I think it's somehow a good one. That is it. Because if you rely on ideas, and if somebody stands next to your ear with a megaphone, okay, an idea, please, Patrick, now, etc. No, and that impatience. That creates a stifling, and these words very much play a role in that. Indeed, the implicit demands of virtue posturing are immense, to the point that all of the good ideas, at least I have ever witnessed coming about, there was always this quintessential moment when we had a breakthrough. Even in all of the great projects we did in hindsight, there was when they were invented, there was always this collective moment that we didn't know whether we had just invented something utterly profound or whether we had definitively gone mad. And a certain amount of post-rationalizing that sort of settled it somehow. But also,
but that's very important, the post-rationalization, and not just
but
kind
also,
of faking.
Well, also there, I wonder. I saw, we've worked in Russia when that was still a possibility, and I had this anecdote, and Sejima worked there at the same time. We were involved more or less in the same project, and we had these plans and we had these seductive strategies. We don't show them the work. We don't show them this, but we show a reason, and the reason leads to this leads to that. We take them, we enroll them in the process, etc., and then we will seduce them to like what we did. But that strategy sort of allowed them to sort of seduce it right back to nothing, because the whole fact that we were apparently logical opened us up to a logical negotiation. So, Sejima came and she presented a 180-meter dome. And she, but first of all, I mean, she then, at a key moment, she doesn't speak English. It's very important. So we have made, right, okay. The Russians looked at each other slightly bewildered. So it said, Schumacher, can the dome, instead of 180 meters, be 150 meters? So he goes, and then no. And she got away with doing it. So I wonder one thing, I think, in the current day and age, whether our rhetoric virtuosity or our ability to sort of democratically allow clients into the process, hoping to seduce them along in our trains of thoughts. I wonder. I mean, I've seen the effectiveness of Calatrava. There's a wonderful documentary about him where he's the worst arsehole on the planet. But boy is it efficient, and boy is it effective, and boy does he, if budget overruns are a measure of the success of star architects, then there is nobody like him. So
we need to take each other to task. Yeah. I think we need to carve into each other, and this is in a friendly, intimate acceptance of each other. As being worthy of being talked to and being carved into. Yeah. And I think, but we need to do it. So, and I think we need to, this taking each other to task is, I think, must be geared up to convergence where we can take collectively responsibility.
But
and we don't evade it by saying, I just want that dome.
No,
the client should not interfere. I mean,
I'm not, of course, advocating that as a model for practice, but I mean, it's just an anecdote. And any way, I write about architecture, but I don't write about architecture. I mean, all of my books are about larger issues in the sense that I think our impossible profession is such a wonderful lens about trends that play out in the world at large. I mean, I write not about works of architecture, I write about the work of an architect. And through that, because I think because of the specific nature of our profession, I think it is such a perfect lens to write. This is a book ultimately about political correctness.
Sure.
Which is a much bigger issue, and which is a much more problematic issues and damaging issues, probably in domains far more important than architecture. But architecture is such a wonderfully, the experiences of architects, I mean, they always talk about their successes greatly, but I mean, our failures, and to some extent, looking at the difficulties along the way, they are such an informative model, I think, for certain larger issues that play out in society at large. I mean, freedom of speech, ultimately freedom of thought, real freedom is under threat across the board. Of course, I write about what I know, because I feel there I can write with the greatest authorities of a certain heartfelt things on a much broader level. I have kids that go to school, and I know what they're being taught there, etc., and the amount of biases ingrained there. So this is ultimately about something else, but architecture to me it's a wonderful profession to do. It's a wonderful profession that serves as a wonderful magnifying lens of the world at large.
And I think you're pointing your finger on something. What I find interesting when you talk about, we're sitting here at the Biennale, and I've been kind of highly frustrated with the Biennales for the last few
I haven't seen anything yet, by the way.
There's some good stuff. There's some good stuff actually we can recommend. There is architecture here, but it's not in a majority. But in the recent Biennales there was largely an absence, and I was very disappointed with architects kind of working for 2 years on things and doing projects, and then when they come to be invited or when they come to curate, they leave all this behind. It's irrelevant. Maybe they're ashamed of it. They think it's uninteresting. And they want to kind of jump on larger issues. And I think it's total overreach where they become dilettante within a few weeks for preparing for a Biennale. And in the end, they display a few slogans in an empty pavilion. It's been kind of devastatingly awful. And I have written about it a number of times. And I think that's something where we have to kind of clean up and commit to architecture. So yes, a lot of currently built architecture seems to be partly because of the themes and maybe largely also hypocritical themes community engagement and inclusiveness I've been writing about, and these kind of sustainability issues, and then we're enlarging the issue to world underdevelopment, poverty, marginal groups, and none of this has anything to do with our day jobs as architects. The profession has no levers whatsoever to engage with that. So it can only ever be a rhetorical signaling. And in the meantime, what we're actually working on is not discussed, not critiqued relative to that. And it's just a vacuous posturing which in a sense empties out this institution of the Venice Biennale. Largely, it's not an absolute wash and wipe out. If absolutely, there are always going to be these nuggets and corners. And even when Rem's show, which I thought was great, the detail show, but the Arsenal was kind of, for me, kind of washout. Wasteful. And the same I would say with schools of architecture, when they migrate to these topics, they don't know any architects anymore, and they don't have reached design the whole of the AA and or Bartlett undergraduate. There's only topics like biodiversity. They're only looking at marginal groups and backward, underdeveloped situations and engage descriptively. I mean, none of them, these students or any architecture, professional architecture in the advanced world, will ever get a commission, and the resources would be badly spent. What these situations need is, well-established standard of sanitation and investment and technology, which we know about for 100 years and take for granted. So it's a total kind of bizarre diversion, and that feeds into this. And that's why I'm saying we have to really kind of address this head on and take that risk. And I think we can think it through. I can argue through why this is counterproductive and false and in a strangely way self-denial and deeply troubling and frustrating. And so you have actually, and then the same comes in because it's so vulnerable and so fragile and indefensible. At the same time, you have this protective political correctness. You can't actually critique it. You can't criticize a student. It becomes an attack on their identity. If you're a white male, you can't say anything in any case. And so you have the situation where basically, because there's no frank critique and engagement. But there's one phrase that there is no end to the degeneracy and downward slide into utter indefensibleness of all production in these schools, because this discourse has been absented from this, and all we have is kind of flattery and reiteration of the litany, and that's devastating.
Yeah, I think history has a pendulum, and history works on the principle that those who were privileged at one point require an overthrow. I mean, that's a very Hegelian Marxist kind of version of history, but I do think that there is that. So the white male has had its moment, and now it's somebody else's turn, and that's very much the sentiment that underlies this. And that might be true, and it's not very nice if you happen to be part of the group that is. I mean, I wouldn't have liked to be bourgeoisie in Russia in 1917. But life sucks, and Mother Nature's a bitch. But it's interesting you say it, because I mean, I wrote a book in between these two books, which was a novel about an architect, a very vain architect, accepting a commission in Africa, only to get fucked by a very corrupt system. But the book there essentially has a part on UN Habitat, on architects and all kinds of humanitarian organizations from the West who go there. They see the slums. You can't call them slums, they're informal settlements, and they do wonderful morphological analyses of mud roads and poor people cooking, and they romanticize it. And then the Chinese come, and the Chinese come with a humongous building industry, and they built the homes. And then the American professors come and say, this is really not African identities. And there's four walls and a roof, which is a pretty universal definition of architecture, and it's that. The problem with the internal Western discussion is that the pendulum shift, which is being perceived, obscures the real pendulum shift that goes on in the world. You say it's not the moment of the white male. I would argue that white males are pretty damn powerful. If 2024 pans out in the wrong direction, in the United States, we have Putin. We have the thing. I mean, Xi Jinping is a yellow version of the white male. Trump or anybody of the Republican Party, they are more powerful than ever in some way. So we can all simulate this happy, victorious renunciation of the white male at the Bartlett, and nobody gives a fuck.
No, but I wasn't.
But that is an important point. A lot of those cultural wars serve as a smokescreen for an ultimate shift in power relations globally, which are almost, we can complain about, it's almost like complaining about the weather. But you go to Davos, yeah? You meet all kinds of people, and they're all totally this, progress, etc. None of them pays any tax. I'm very curious about the funding of some of the. I mean, I know a little bit about the funding of some, particularly our own. And there is a. Let me say this in polite, general terms. There is biennales par excellence are wonderful examples, between the utter contrast where the money comes from and the message that they convey. I mean, they're like mini versions of Switzerland in some way. A utopic, wonderful. It's number one on the Where to Be Born index, and we all know, what generates Switzerland's wealth. And the hypocrisy is complete, and as long as we don't stare the hypocrisy in the face, certain malignant tendencies may get the better of all of us. We are looking at a footnote under a microscope, hoping it'll turn into a novel. That's my definition of, I'm not sure, probably of any biennale. Anyway.
Shall we open it up?
Yeah, I think we better.
Any challenges, questions?
Well,
comments, notes?
For people that are suspicious about too much language, we use a hell of a lot of it.
Language is seducing.
Huh?
Your language is seducing.
Mm.
That's the danger of this discussion as well. Because I wanted to ask you, what's the conclusion? I missed the first half.
Conclusion for me would be have a moratorium on prof speak, all the categories we've been listing, and for 3 years, and force everybody to talk about other things.
I mean, I don't know. So my conclusion is when the subtitle workload, blah, 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 the conclusion of that is it's a load of crap. That's my conclusion, very obviously. But I mean, there is a conclusion. There's also an aim, and maybe the aim of the book is more important than the conclusion. And the aim is modest. I hope, that architects who have eaten up these terms, after reading the book, they feel slightly more embarrassed about using them.
They should.
I have no illusion that I can make anybody stop using whatever words, nor would I want to, but maybe I can, in a humble way, make them slightly uncomfortable so that they go slightly red in the face the next time they use the word livability. So it's a written form of stand-up comedy.
Then the internal recursive structures are never consciously perceived because they constitute our consciousness. And furthermore, it is a fundamental feature of culturally-derived facts that the word itself, the arrangement of phonics, becomes partially constitutive of the fact itself. So the point here is that the more complex the fact is, the more divorced the word might be from what we're actually trying to express. So therefore, I struggle to understand why the inability of most speakers to consciously control the way language is used disqualifies the truth of its shared social functioning, and why the words that you are using are so special when, for example, you utilize the word suicide to expose the qualifying methodologies of these words, but that itself relies upon this culturally constructed truth that science.
Yeah, of course it does. But it's my version of the. But I mean, when you talk about speakers in particular, do you mean more Patrik or more me? Because I mean, of course, you can only use language in that way by definition. You know, language at best is an approximation of the truth. That's all we have. That is what language is by definition. I think there are just certain approximations which to me are more convincing and more productive than the prevailing ones at the moment. You know, and you don't write necessarily, you don't write to be propositional. The purpose of writing is not even to tell the truth. You can't. I mean, the truth is like, you know, the shadows in Plato's cave. Writing, by definition, is about peeling off layers of falsehood, about peeling off lies, about peeling off inaccuracies, hoping that the more you do that, the more consistent you do that, you have some hope of actually getting closer to what is true. I think that is language by definition. It's an inept instrument, and therefore writing is very much... The best writing is about the ineptitudes of language, using language to display the ineptitudes of language, I think.
I disagree.
Okay.
That's kind of a deconstructivist stance. For instance, I would say, you're saying kind of the words we use, or critical vocabulary we pose against prof speak, I would say the challenge of saying some of these things are pseudoscience relies on a kind of notion of science. Yes, it does. And now we can go into this, whether there is something like science, whether there are criteria and systems of value and processes which we can trust for good reasons, and why there's a difference between science and pseudoscience. I would defend it. So I think I would reject this kind of implied relativism. Mm-hmm. And that's actually part of the problem of our current discourse, that we have this, everybody has their own subjective truth, their own proposals which need to be accepted, and everything, all the arguments that's incommensurable. That's the end of discourse. And people withdraw and saying, don't talk to me, I know what I want, and let me do it. So I think, yes, there is science, and there are many examples of that. Actually, our civilization has been built on that, rational processes and scientific discourse, which is, of course, premised on open, frank critiquing, when there's no hierarchies, in an open system of journals and debates. And that's why we have these devices, and we can take a flight to Australia, leaning back, watching 5 movies, and have a few nutritious meals on the way, and then pop up. That's power, that's material plenty, that's material freedom, and it's based on science. So science does exist, and I think the same notion of science comes in when I reject these, let's say, flippant and false pseudoscientific agendas which are foisted on architecture. So I think I defend it.
But sorry,
and we can talk for another 3 hours, and I might get you to the point.
My specialism is brevity by default almost in this discussion. But I think that
my specialty is full length.
I know. Yeah. So, great.
Long form.
Yeah. One of the wonderful aspects of science is that science has the ability to disprove former conclusions of science. One of the aspects of pseudoscience is that it insists on absolutes without any base. That would be my definition. I mean, science allows for that. Science is empirical by definition. It starts from a hypothesis, and through empirical processes it tests these hypotheses. Pseudoscience is insisting the Earth is flat without any basis. And
it's not science versus pseudoscience. The point is saying you were able to bypass a lot of words by simply utilizing this preconception of pseudoscience. So you rely on this word to capture a shared understanding between all of us. So the way that word pseudoscience functions is exactly the same as these words that you're speaking against function in society. But the point is, for example, an AI software collages concepts and words that already exist, small constructions, to say something. The fact that it functions in that way, the fact that most conversation is absolutely banal, does not mean that that same language cannot be used to write poetry. You cannot dismiss the language because it is weaponized or utilized in a bad way. So I'm
I would argue that much of Prospeak constitutes poetry. Can I read something?
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, it has to be about the book a little bit, this thing. So sorry for claiming the floor. So, a little, sorry, I need to find a little explanation. So the book, it analyzes language in a certain way, and it talks about euphemisms, it talks about partly about the interchangeability between nouns and verbs, which is another wonderful ability of the English language, and in meetings, that in a way creates a wonderful confusion. You know, the word work, take the word work. The work is to work, to do something, but work is also something already done. So if you apply that to a lot of words and you have a meeting, there's a perpetual confusion whether there's an action list of something people have to do as a result of the meeting, or whether the meeting is covering conclusions already reached and therefore a purely reflexive thing. Then there are words that are, you know, a word like green, it's a noun, it's a verb, and it's even an adjective. I mean, it's a color. On that, I think we can all agree. So, maturing by the day, Prospeak, meanwhile, allows for the translation of almost all lay speak. Lay speak is normal English. Take the following sentence. Any architect with a certain awareness and understanding of sustainability will try to design green buildings to further improve the quality of the environment. This is taken from the mission statement of Allies and Morrison, by the way. But in Prospeak, that translates as follows. Smart sustainability, mindful built environment practitioners, architect to green, green, green. So when used proficiently, Prospeak is actually poetry. It's kind of Dada poetry. Yeah.
Thanks. I can't wait for the book here. Quick question: how much do you get into the idea of accountability? Into the idea of accountability, of taking responsibility for one's actions, and how much do you think this language are ways to kind of launder one's accountability? You see what I mean? Maybe there's a complicity between people not having to take responsibility and adopting certain language to gloss.
Could be. I mean, you could regard the fact that all of this language has been so successful in being adopted by architects. You could, of course, also turn that around as the fact that it's an indication of the vacuousness of the discourse among architects. And if had that discourse been more solid and more considered, this would never have proliferated to the degree it has. You know, in the book, it's interesting in some way. The book starts, the first word is starchitecture. And the last essay is about innovation, and it's called Architecture Without Architects. So the book describes a 20-year-long trajectory from, first of all, the total adoration of architects. You know, Frank Gehry did the Guggenheim, Bilbao thrived as a city. Everybody attributed that to that building, that the story is a bit more complex. That's what the essay accounts. But if evidently a building can change the fate of an entire city, then you no longer need a very complicated planning process, you no longer need policies, you no longer need a lot of things, and then actually, although it's an expensive building, it's a very cheap way of changing the fate of the city. So if buildings can evidently change the fate of cities that radically, boy, they can be expensive because the dividends. Bilbao was the first moment, one of the key moments where the awareness, you know, we as architects, we all know that buildings cost money. And by the time our task is finished, they start to make money. And we are wonderfully oblivious of that. We happily execute cost cuts, etc., but they make money. So it's the first awareness within the world of architecture, not coincidentally after the fall of the Berlin Wall, about the other side, the revenue side of buildings. And that awareness triggered an almost godlike status of architect, you know, and then the essay goes on, and, you know, you have ever larger budget overruns. It goes across the globe and it ends right back in Spain with Calatrava and Valencia, who creates a budget overrun that is so large that any theoretical financial benefit for the city as a whole is already preemptively eaten up by his building. That is too expensive. So that was that. That was one extreme. And then the end of the book is about, certain technical processes, the nerds in Silicon Valley, planning AI, etc., presuming the redundancy of the architect forever because we'll have systems doing that. Now, I take comfort in, and I think we have worked very closely with people who have a somewhat similar status, to the architect of the Guggenheim in Bilbao. So I know firsthand, I can assure you, that myth of the is not true. That the inside reality, it is like the kitchen of a Chinese restaurant, 100%. So I knew the former was never true. And therefore, I am firmly convinced that the latter will never happen, or will never happen completely. I think history also has a wonderful way of leaving unfinished trends. So I take comfort in the fact that I know the former was never true, and the latter will never happen. And accountability obviously resides somewhere in between.
I want to pick up on your kind of thrust, which I think maybe Reinier has to also clarify, but whether the issue is that these prof-speak phrases and themes and do-good kind of agendas are just used to cover up and whitewash and greenwash and avoid accountability for precisely these issues. And I think that's partly the case. But I think there are some of the themes which I think we have to kind of dig deeper, and where I would say they're inherently problematic, even though they come along as unquestionable moral imperatives. And I'll just throw this in, maybe see what the reaction is. But
I think
no, I wanted to elaborate the 2 points. One is community engagement, and the other one is inclusiveness. So, which seem to be, first of all, the first thing I wanted to say with respect, let's say, start with community engagement is probably, yes, used rhetorically only and hypocritically, but I would also say that it actually can't be done for a number of reasons. It doesn't work. It's wholly unrealistic. First of all, communities don't exist. It's a kind of unreal euphemism in the metropolitan societies. If there's, to the extent that there's still there might be kind of more like signifying less productive kind of segments of society. But also, if you think about it through, when you actually have the way it's operationalized as community participation, there is an absolute minuscule participation of a few people. They become obstacles possibly. It's an entry road for NIMBYism. And that's why architects are needed to kind of chart that territory and allow the project to go ahead. But a lot of projects are not going ahead through there. It's for me highly questionable that you kind of privilege some, let's say, what you would call kind of the current residents and owners, over and above the ability of the future of the city and decide to invite new end users, new residents, new people who are either left out and excluded altogether. What's the reason? As if you kind of a whole city district is private ownership, and you allow kind of community slogans, people who are private interests to exclude people, let that happen. I think that's all fallacious, and this NIMBYism is really why we have a housing crisis, supply crisis. Similarly with inclusiveness, I think there's a fallacy in many ways, particularly when it comes to public space. So I read the definition of inclusive space is a space where everybody can equally feel a sense of belonging. And if you think about the whole of society, and this idea that a city would kind of, on all its sides, in every quarter and every side, would equally mix all groups in an equal mixity, ends up a kind of semi-random mixity is totally the opposite of how cities actually function. This is all about some kind of structure, self-sorting and affiliating, so you find each other and to exploit synergies between people, which precisely it isn't. All-inclusive everywhere. And if you think about what people actually want, there's the maximum exclusivity. And I'm not only, maybe, and there's a certain kind of all-too-human kind of snobbishness and social distinction, let's put this aside, but they certainly want to have agglomerations according to affiliation, to relevancy, of cooperation, of the different groups, the way their cultural patterns fit and synergize, and those who are not. And this is, and the slogan of inclusiveness, all inclusive everywhere, and awards for inclusive architecture, we challenge, hold on, it's a fallacy to begin with. It's misguided and impossible. And therefore, once you try to do it, it either inherently becomes rhetorical, and if you really try to realize it, you're actually backfiring and preventing urban development. So it's not just hypocritical. It's not just covering up the great real agenda but these agendas themselves are inherently problematic, and in fact regressive and ahistorical.
So on that note, quickly, how can architects take more responsibility for their work?
We actually need to do it collectively by discussing it through. Internally first, what the ingredients are, what is actually
Can Patrik have another bottle of water?
What's the societal function of the discipline of architecture and design disciplines? In terms of demarcating from engineering and system engineering, demarcating from art and other domains. What is our contribution to the built environment? And we need to define that. I have definitions. I mean, you can read my works, but so we need to define that first of all, and we need to define what the societal process and what's the current state of society historically. What kind of dynamics are evolving? What's the frontier? And by the way, I think we as architects here, coming to Biennales, leading major firms, being professors at School of Architecture, what we should be doing, I think, is working on the frontier, on the frontier edge of this civilization. We should be doing these kind of creative industry hubs, these intensive high productivity cities. We're taking on Google campus and where the thing is happening, so that we can next year work less and have more degrees of freedom, etc., etc. So that's another plea I have. So don't think that we, as this discourse, I think is gearing on the frontier and the rest is trickle down. I don't think we have solutions for people who are 100 years behind.
I think your bringing up accountability is very interesting, because I have I think it's so architectural competition. And sorry to resort to the anecdotal all the time, but architectural competition, like 20 years ago, you used to encounter architects in a jury. You talk about taking each other to task, etc. That happened in the context of architecture. That happened in a
Great, thanks so much. That's great.
that happened in the context of architectural competition. Over time, I witnessed that there is fewer and fewer architects in the juries of competition, to the point that there are no architects, and therefore nobody who instinctively falls in love with a project, and that used to be the kind of competition winners. Now you can, instead there are people from other domains. There are often people in the institutions, in the politicians, and they select a project on the basis of how well they think they can defend it. And therefore all of these terms are tick boxes. All of these terms have elaborate series of subterms, supposedly measurable, that allows them to be accountable for the choice. They don't have a clue why they made it. And that is what happened. I mean, the outcome of competition, I simply have to say, I don't get it anymore. If I see in our firm what competitions we win, if I see what we lose, I simply don't understand. It's partly that. This is about deferral. This is the language of deferral. This is the language when I don't have a fucking clue of what I'm talking about. So I say it's livable because it changes. This is Kafka. Kafka in the extreme. I think, and so we can be more accountable. We would be more accountable if we simply had a moratorium on all of the words in here for a while, because it would force you to really articulate without defaulting to words that everybody uses and nobody knows what they mean. I have one favorite essay in the book, and it's the title of the essay is Here Nor There, and it's about placemaking. That is a word I don't know what it means. It's a word, for one, that is not in the English dictionary. It is a word that until recently Microsoft Word underlined it with a red line as a spelling mistake that Grammarly considered eliminating altogether. Nevertheless, that is the brief of a lot of projects. So there is a little anecdote. I talked to a developer, and he says, and there's a long brief, and he says, but it's all about placement. You don't even have to read it, but it's all about placemaking. And I don't know what it is. It's the first time I heard it. I don't know what it means, but I can't. But this is the client speaking. So his directives, they make sense by definition, even or particularly when they don't. I nod. I raise an eyebrow. I an approving look, like contemplative look. I have no idea what he's talking about. And then he apologizes. And he says, but you know all of this, of course. I mean, placemaking must be second nature to you. And I don't know what the word is. I don't know what it means. And maybe he doesn't know what it means. Maybe nobody knows what it means. And maybe that's the precise purpose of the word. If a word has no definitive meaning, there is no disagreement possible as a result of its use. So if you have enough words like placemaking, world peace might finally become a probability. And maybe that is, manufactured consensus in the absence of agreement. That is what this is the language of deferral in the extreme, to the point. There is, in such a thing, you have a director of place, you have a placemaking officer. I mean, municipalities, there are job titles of people that have the word placemaking, which is a word that has no meaning. You find a meaning on Wikipedia. I mean, Fred Kent is the inventor of the word, and placemaking, according to him, is an innate ability we all have. And the Wikipedia page shows a public park, and there is a piano in it. So something is a place when you put a piano in it. And that is the vagaries which have become part of our official institutional infrastructure. And that is funny, but also in some way hugely dangerous. Peter?
Okay, well, you say that it's not a license to kill. Have you read the Grenfell report inquiry?
Not in full, no. But I mean, what are you getting at?
Well, because I thought your chapter on regulation, and particularly sustainability and so on, I thought it was very well researched, very interesting, a good survey.
Yeah.
Now, how do you then make that relevant, what those things attempt to achieve? Either do you not see them as relevant to what you do as an architect and does somebody else do it? Or how do you actually make those things happen if you think that, let's say, climate change is a reality?
Well, let me turn that around, and obviously, the subtitle of my book, no architect would want to be unsane, unsustainable, unlivable, ugly, etc. So a lot of these words are a colossal monument to the obvious. Climate change, I think, is in many ways obvious. And sustainability, of course, or whatever you want to call it, I mean, to deal with resources in such a way that you stop, and there's a much more scientific side to this than the word alone, but that so much is produced in the wake of the good that is bad. I see, so a whole series, we did this thing in the office, so research buildings that won sustainability awards, and you click, one mediocre German carbuncle after another, and they look so much like buildings looked before there was the word sustainability. So that, really, and then climate change is, and I believe that's true, is this apocalyptic reality that is confronting us in a very aggressive, extreme way. And I see all these marginal adjustments of business as usual. And I see at the same time scientific reports about climate change. Look at this building. Really? Really? And that is the point of that essay. I think many of these terms are not about the fact that they embody lies, is that they are euphemisms for something that is infinitely more serious, is infinitely more scientific. The whole advocacy for timber buildings You know, timber good, concrete bad. That is the simplistic conclusion that we apparently have time for. If all buildings were to be executed in timber, the climatic consequences would be worse. They would all be executed in concrete. The biggest reduction in CO2 emission in the world was when China transitioned from coal to gas, which, by the way, is still a fossil fuel. And there is such a massively, science, pseudoscience. I find it a very endearing interjection. Of course there is something like science. God hope there is something like science. But all of this language that is being practiced by endless people who are officer of placemaking is distinctly unscientific. My book is a plea, not, I'm not a climate change denier. My plea is in some ways for a much greater radicality in all of these domains. I know, and I don't think it's somebody else's business. I think it's also a call for a much closer integration between...
But you know what I find about it?
What do you find about it?
That architects leap onto this, which is to a large extent, particularly those buildings where nothing is in the outward form and appearance has been transformed, an engineering responsibility process, expertise and engineering science. And then you have an architect coming up and wants to talk. This is the only thing they talk about it, because here you are on firm ground. You seem to have a rationality. It's all engineering rationality. Foster's saying, how much do my buildings weigh? And every Foster explanation is engineering, refers to engineering, but the design decisions remain kind of in the domain of the ephemeral or ineffable. And I'm working on actually making these issues which are in that domain of design decisions, morphology, formal repertoires, with new kind of quests of social functionality, bring them out of the ineffable into a rational discourse where I take responsibility for my part. And when it comes to sustainability, what I find satisfying, the architectural contribution to it, when it has to do with the organization of the volumes, with the morphology, with the articulation of the facade through brise-soleil systems, differentiation, and there it actually brings home what I talk about impermeabilism and tectonism as the high level of sophistication and delivering towards the engineering, but also generating a new morphology which is inherently makes the built environment much more legible, for instance. And we can use that for our purposes, which I think their legibility and making transparent is a big part. So I have in my book on tectonism, which is coming out, I have a chapter on environmental engineering, feeding into architectural innovation and a new repertoire of articulation and organization. So we have to find our space in this and not defer to what's under the hood, which machines I've decided on, and which concrete material I've selected. That's not architecture. That's in a sense, let's take this for granted, do it and don't talk about it. And if you have nothing else to say but regurgitating, bringing the engineering chapter, and when you have a public lecture to give, how poor are you in the self-reflective capacity? And I think our discipline, that's my frustration, and the frustration for me, I've kind of moved way beyond all of that and have a lot of things to say. The discipline is ignorant, backward, incapable of even absorbing what I'm talking about is incredibly frustrating for me. But I'm just giving you a hint. If that's what these top architects are doing, they can't talk about architecture because they find it irrational and unaccountable, and they can only talk about engineering. Wow, in what abysmal condition are we as a discipline in terms of intellectual, theoretical, self-understanding, etc.
Hey, I have an obligation at 7:30.
We're far away from that.
I don't know how any of this is.
I think we are running.
Yeah, because I could opt
but we
for
have
the long form as well, but I did want to see the Biennale. I'm supposed to have an unreasonable
No, we can close here.
about.
But there's another event, by the way, here at 4 o'clock.
Okay. So there is. There is a cap. You need to go.
Thank you. Good stuff.